What unsettled the avoidant most was not confrontation. It was your composure. People often misunderstand avoidant psychology because they assume the deepest impact comes from emotional intensity, dramatic arguments, emotional breakdowns, desperate attempts to reconnect. But avoidants are not usually destabilized by emotional chaos. In many ways, they are adapted to it. They know how to retreat from intensity. They know how to shut down, detach, intellectualize, disappear emotionally, or create enough distance to regain control of the situation. What they are far less prepared for is someone who remains emotionally grounded while refusing to participate in the cycle. That is where your power became visible. At first, they expected the same pattern they had likely experienced many times before. They expected pursuit. They expected emotional negotiation. They expected you to keep trying to prove your value to someone who kept moving the emotional finish line further away. And to be fair, this expectation did not appear out of nowhere. Many people, when faced with inconsistency, become more emotionally attached. The human nervous system often interprets unpredictability as something to solve. We chase clarity. We chase reassurance. We chase the version of the connection we experienced in the beginning. Avoidants unconsciously rely on this dynamic more than most people realize. Not necessarily because they are evil or calculating, but because distance has become their psychological survival strategy. Emotional control gives them relief. If they sense expectations, vulnerability, dependency, or emotional intensity increasing, they often create space automatically, sometimes through silence, sometimes through mixed signals, sometimes through emotional coldness disguised as independence. And in previous relationships, these behaviors probably worked exactly as intended. The other person became more emotionally reactive, more anxious, more desperate for connection. The T reaction restored the avoidant's sense of control. But then they met you at a different stage of your evolution. Something changed in you. Maybe not immediately. Maybe you struggled at first like anyone would. Maybe you questioned yourself, overanalyzed conversations, replayed memories, tried to understand the emotional contradictions, but eventually, something deeper activated. You stopped interpreting their distance as proof of your inadequacy. You stopped believing that your worth depended on your ability to keep someone emotionally available. And that shift altered the entire psychological dynamic between you. Because once a person stops abandoning themselves, manipulation loses power. Your calm became disruptive. Your refusal to chase became psychologically loud. And the avoidant could feel it even if they never admitted it directly. People think silence is empty, but psychologically, silence communicates enormous amounts of information. Your silence said, "I will not destroy. Oh, why myself trying to force emotional reciprocity?" Your boundaries said, "I can love deeply without surrendering my dignity." Your emotional restraint said, "I no longer need your validation to confirm my value." That is rare. Most people do not realize how threatening self-possession can feel to someone who depends on emotional distance to regulate themselves. Because your stability exposed something uncomfortable. It revealed that the cycle only works when both people participate in it. The moment one person steps out of emotional dependency, the entire structure begins to collapse. And this is where the avoidant often experiences a kind of internal confusion they cannot easily explain. They may tell themselves they wanted space, but your ability to actually give that space without falling apart publicly unsettles them. Why? Because emotionally healthy detachment forces self-reflection. It removes the distraction. Suddenly, there is no emotional chaos to focus on, no dramatic comparison, conflict to justify withdrawal, no constant reassurance requests to point at and say, "This is why I needed distance." Now they are left alone with themselves, and for many avoidants, that is the hardest place to be. Your composure became a mirror, not an aggressive mirror, not a cruel one, just an honest one. You reflected back the emotional imbalance without needing to announce it, and psychologically that can stay with someone for a very long time. Because deep down, they recognize the difference between someone who is emotionally manipulative and someone who has genuinely outgrown the need to chase. That distinction matters. You did not become cold. You became clear. You did not lose your ability to care. You simply stopped sacrificing your inner peace to maintain a one-sided emotional dynamic. And in doing so, you demonstrated something avoidants rarely encounter: emotional strength without emotional aggression. That is why your presence became unforgettable. Not because you begged louder than everyone else. Not because you fought harder, but because you remained emotionally intact in an environment designed to make you abandon yourself. And whether they consciously understand it or not, people remember the individuals who break unhealthy patterns without losing their humanity in the process. Because true power is not found in controlling another person. It is found in finally mastering yourself. What makes this dynamic so psychologically complex is that many avoidants are not fully conscious of the emotional tests they create. People often imagine these behaviors as carefully planned acts of manipulation, but in reality, much of it operates beneath conscious awareness. Avoidant attachment is built around protection. It is a nervous system strategy designed to minimize vulnerability, dependence, and emotional exposure. And because of that, the avoidant mind is constantly scanning for signs that closeness may eventually lead to loss of control, disappointment, shame, or emotional engulfment. So instead of moving directly toward intimacy, they often create conditions that indirectly measure another person's emotional stability. That is why the mixed signals feel so destabilizing. One moment there is warmth, connection, vulnerability, even deep emotional intensity. Then suddenly there is withdrawal, distance, silence, emotional inconsistency. And the person on the receiving end often becomes trapped trying to decode the contradiction. They think, if the connection was real, why are they acting this way? But psychologically, the contradiction is the point. The avoidant is attempting to maintain connection without fully surrendering emotional control. And unconsciously, they are watching your response very carefully. Will you collapse emotionally when they pull away? Will you abandon your boundaries to keep access to them? Will you tolerate emotional neglect in exchange for temporary closeness? Will your fear of losing the connection override your self-respect? These are not always deliberate questions in their mind, but they are psychological tests nonetheless. Because people reveal what they believe about themselves through what they tolerate. This is why avoidants often repeat the same relational patterns. If someone continually overfunctions emotionally, chases validation, accepts inconsistency, or sacrifices their needs to preserve the relationship, the avoidant learns something important. Emotional imbalance can continue without consequences. The cycle survives because the other person keeps adapting to dysfunction instead of confronting it internally. But your response changed the outcome. At some point, you stopped negotiating against your own worth. You stopped treating emotional confusion as proof that you needed to try harder. And that shift was deeply significant because it interrupted the pattern they unconsciously expected to repeat. Most people think overcoming an avoidant means becoming a mott, inelly detached, or punishing them with indifference. But real transformation is quieter than that. It happens when someone develops enough internal clarity to stop personalizing emotionally unavailable behavior. You began to understand that another person's inability to provide consistency was not evidence of your inadequacy. It was evidence of their unresolved relationship with vulnerability itself. That realization changes everything. Because once you stop interpreting rejection as a measure of your value, fear begins to lose authority over your decisions. You stop performing emotional labor just to secure crumbs of connection. You stop trying to earn basic reciprocity. You stop shrinking yourself to accommodate someone else's discomfort with intimacy. And psychologically, that is where the balance of power shifts. The avoidant expected emotional survival instincts to keep you trapped in the cycle. They expected your attachment to override your boundaries. But instead, you became more aware, more grounded, more emotionally disciplined. And that is deeply confronting for someone who has spent years depending on distance as a form of regulation. Because now they are faced with something unfamiliar. Accountability without direct confrontation. You did not need to attack them for the truth to become visible. Your growth exposed it naturally. The healthier you became, the more obvious the imbalance became. Not because you shamed them, but because emotional clarity removes the illusions unhealthy dynamics depend on. And this is the part many people miss. Avoidants are often highly sensitive beneath the surface. Their detachment is not proof that they feel nothing. In fact, many feel overwhelmed by emotions they do not fully know how to process safely. So when someone they expected to remain emotionally dependent suddenly becomes emotionally self-sufficient, it creates a powerful internal disruption. They begin to realize that their old defenses no longer produce the same results. The distance no longer controls you. The silence no longer defines you. The inconsistency no longer weakens your sense of self. And that realization forces an uncomfortable confrontation with reality. The problem was never your inability to love deeply. The problem was their inability to remain emotionally present without fear taking over. This is why your evolution mattered so much psychologically. You became evidence that healthy love cannot exist where self-abandonment is required. And whether they consciously admit it or not, people are deeply affected by those who refuse to participate in emotional dysfunction without becoming cruel themselves. You did not win because you played the game better. You won because you stopped playing it entirely. And there is something profoundly powerful about a person who no longer needs to prove their worth to someone incapable of recognizing it consistently. Because at that point, the attachment stops being driven by feature, and starts being guided by truth. And truth has a way of exposing every illusion eventually. The moment you stopped fighting for your value was the moment your value became undeniable. What ultimately affected the avoidant was not your pain. It was your recovery. Pain, in many ways, is familiar territory for someone with avoidant defenses. They know how to emotionally compartmentalize. They know how to disconnect from uncomfortable feelings long enough to regain a sense of internal control. If conflict happens, they retreat. If emotions become overwhelming, they minimize them. If intimacy begins to feel too exposing, they create distance and convince themselves that independence is safer than vulnerability. But healing is different. Healing creates a kind of psychological confrontation that distance cannot easily escape. Because when someone genuinely heals, they stop revolving around the avoidant emotionally. And that shift forces the avoidant to witness something they are often deeply uncomfortable facing. Another person becoming whole without their validation, approval, or presence. At first, they may assume your silence is temporary. They may believe you are still emotionally waiting for them beneath the surface. Many avoidants are accustomed to relationships where emotional attachment lingers long after the connection becomes unhealthy. They expect emotional gravity to keep pulling the other person back in, and to some extent, that expectation is understandable. Human beings naturally struggle to detach from unresolved emotional experiences. But then something unexpected happens. You begin changing in ways they cannot control. Your energy becomes calmer. Your reactions become less emotionally charged. You stop trying to decode every mixed signal. You stop interpreting their withdrawal as a reflection of your worth. Slowly, your life stops orbiting around the emotional uncertainty they created. And this is where the avoidant often begins experiencing a form of quiet psychological disorientation. Because they are used to emotional distance creating dependency, not freedom. They are used to absence increasing obsession, not clarity. They are used to people fighting harder for connection when intimacy becomes inconsistent. But your healing reversed the pattern completely. Instead of becoming smaller under emotional pressure, you expanded. Instead of becoming emotionally trapped, you became emotionally aware. And awareness changes the entire dynamic. You started seeing the relationship not just through the lens of attachment, but through the lens of truth. You recognized how much of your emotional exhaustion came from trying to stabilize something that could never fully stabilize while one person remained afraid of vulnerability. That realization is transformative because it removes fantasy from the equation. And without fantasy, unhealthy attachment begins losing its grip. This is why your healing became so psychologically significant. Not because you became perfect, not because you stopped feeling sadness, but because you stopped abandoning yourself in the name of love. That is the moment emotional power returns. Avoidants often spend years outrunning emotional discomfort without realizing they are also outrunning emotional intimacy, emotional safety, and emotional peace. Their defenses protect them from vulnerability, but those same defenses also isolate them from the depth of connection they secretly crave. And when they encounter someone who breaks free from the cycle, instead of remaining trapped inside it, they are forced to confront that contradiction directly. Your growth became evidence of a freedom they themselves do not yet possess. Because real healing requires emotional honesty. It requires sitting with grief instead of escaping it. It requires confronting abandonment wounds instead of numbing them through distance, distraction, or detachment. And many avoidants have spent so much of their lives surviving emotionally that they never fully learned how to process emotions safely. But you did something different. You walked into the discomfort instead of running from it. You allowed yourself to feel the disappointment, the confusion, the loss, the unanswered questions. And instead of letting those emotions destroy your identity, you used them to rebuild a stronger relationship with yourself. That is why your healing carried so much weight psychologically. It represented emotional courage rather than emotional avoidance. And deep down, people recognize courage when they see it, even if it unsettles them, especially if it unsettles them. Because your recovery removed the illusion that emotional suffering was necessary for love to feel meaningful. You stopped romanticizing inconsistency. You stopped calling emotional unavailability depth. You stopped mistaking anxiety for connection. And once you reached that level of clarity, the relationship could no longer define you in the same way. That is what changed everything. The avoidant may still think about you long after the connection fades, not simply because of emotional attachment, but because you became associated with a truth they cannot easily dismiss. You showed them what emotional maturity looks like in practice, not through lectures, not through demands, but through embodiment. You demonstrated that a person can love deeply without losing themselves, that a person can walk away without hatred, that a person can heal without becoming cold. And psychologically, that leaves a lasting imprint. Because most people never forget the person who exposed the difference between attachment and genuine emotional freedom. Your healing became a mirror reflecting both possibility and limitation. Possibility for what love could look like without fear controlling it. Limitation because they now have to confront how much of their own life has been shaped by emotional avoidance. And that realization can end someone's mind for years. Because nothing challenges emotional avoidance more powerfully than witnessing someone transform their pain into peace. And in the end, your healing did what your suffering never could. It forced the truth into the light. There is a reason certain people remain unforgettable long after a relationship ends. It is not always because the relationship itself was the longest, the most dramatic, or even the most outwardly passionate. Sometimes the people who leave the deepest psychological imprint are the ones who quietly alter the way another person understands themselves. And that is what happened here. You became an experience the avoidant could not easily categorize. At first, they likely assumed you would eventually fit into the same emotional narrative as everyone else. Maybe they believed distance would weaken your confidence. Maybe they assumed inconsistency would keep you emotionally attached. Maybe they thought time would slowly reduce you into another unresolved connection they could compartmentalize and move beyond without confronting anything deeply uncomfortable inside themselves. But you disrupted that expectation completely, because instead of becoming consumed by the emotional confusion, you evolved beyond it. And psychologically, that creates a very different kind of memory. Human beings do not simply remember people, they remember the emotional impact. They remember who challenged their internal world. They remember who exposed contradictions they were trying to avoid. And perhaps most importantly, they remember the people who forced them to confront the gap between the person they present to the world and the person they actually are underneath their defenses. That is why your presence lingered, not because you demanded attention, not because you tried to haunt them emotionally, but because authenticity leaves traces that manipulation never can. Avoidants often believe distance protects them from emotional consequence. If things become too intense, they withdraw. If vulnerability feels threatening, they detach. If emotional accountability appears unavoidable, they convince themselves that independence is the safer path. Over time, this creates the illusion that they can escape emotional discomfort simply by creating enough space from it. But there is one thing distance cannot erase: self-awareness once it has been awakened, and you awakened it, not through force, not through punishment, but through contrast. Your emotional resilience stood in direct contrast to the patterns they had normalized for years. You represented emotional steadiness in a world where they relied on emotional escape. You represented self-respect without cruelty, boundaries without revenge, depth without emotional dependency. That combination is rare. Most people, when deeply hurt, move toward one of two extremes. They either become emotionally desperate or emotionally hardened. But you chose a different path. You stayed here. Man, you allowed yourself to grieve, reflect, and heal without turning your pain into bitterness. And psychologically, that is incredibly difficult for avoidants to dismiss, because it removes the defensive stories they often rely on internally. They cannot simply label you as too needy if you eventually stop chasing. They cannot fully convince themselves you were the problem if your healing became visible through peace rather than retaliation. They cannot easily minimize your value if your absence eventually brought more emotional clarity than your presence ever did. And this is where the psychological imprint becomes permanent.